Welcome, students. Today, we are going to talk a lot about vertical angles, adjacent angles, complementary angles, supplementary angles, and congruent angles, and how we can see or find them in a given figure. So the first thing I want to talk about is what vertical angles are. Now, vertical angles, right here, vertical angles are angles that are across from each other when two lines intersect. So for instance, in this diagram, let's look at this blue line here and this blue line here. They intersect and they form four angles. They form angle 5 and angle 2, and those would be considered vertical angles. Now, I don't want to emphasize that vertical doesn't mean it's because it's one's above and one's below. Vertical can also mean left and right. For instance, the combination of 6 and 1 together, this complete blue angle all the way to here, is a vertical angle with this complete angle here. Those are vertical angles. One thing about vertical angles is they are congruent. So if I was to mark, come on, there we go. If I was to mark angle 5 and angle 2 with a different color, those two angles are congruent. Congruent as well because vertical angles are congruent. The combination of 6 and 1 added together and the combination of 4 and 3 added together would be congruent. And they are also called vertical angles. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is what adjacent angles are. So adjacent angles, pen color, there we go. Adjacent angles are angles that are next to each other. So if I was to talk about angle 5, it has two adjacent angles. It has an adjacent angle here at 6 because it shares a side in common with 5, and angle 4 because it also shares a common side with angle 5. Now the interesting thing is there's actually more adjacent angles than those two because I can actually do a larger adjacent angle. What I mean by that is I could consider the angle that goes along line 4 here out to 3. That's also an adjacent angle. It's just a larger angle. The most important thing to realize is that adjacent angles share one side in common, and it's two angles that are next to each other. So hopefully that's fairly simple concept. They're just two angles that are next to each other that share a side in common. The next thing I want to talk about is what complementary angles are. Complementary angles, so let's do a different pen color. Complementary angles add up to 90 degrees. It's two angles that add up to 90 degrees. For instance, angle 4 and angle 5 add up to 90 degrees. Those would be considered complementary angles. Now I know they add up to 90 degrees because the straight line here is 180, angle 3 is 90, so these two together must be another 90 degrees in order to form a line of 180 degrees, which in a sense leads into what supplementary angles are. Supplementary angles add up to 180. So if I was to talk about supplementary angles, I would say that angle 3 and the combination of 2 and 1 together would be considered supplementary. So let's look at a different slide, and I want to help you understand that sometimes we're going to give more complex diagrams, and we still want to be able to look and tell, okay, what are vertical angles? Well, 3 would be vertical to 1. 9 would be vertical to 11. 6 would be vertical to 8. Likewise, 10 would be vertical to 12. 2 would be vertical to 4. 7 would be vertical to 5. Those are vertical angles. Okay. Now, adjacent angles would be angles that are next to each other. So if I was to do adjacent angles, I would say 2 is adjacent to 3. 7 is adjacent to 8. It's also actually, 7 is also adjacent to 6 because it's next to it. It shares a side and it has that common vertex right here. 2 and 3 are adjacent because they have a common vertex and they share a side. 4 and 3 are adjacent. There are no complementary in this diagram, but there are supplementary. I don't see any right angles. That's why I know there's no complementary. But there are many supplementary angles. For instance, if I was to look at angle 10, it's supplementary to angle 11 because it forms this straight line. The two together, add up to 180. And that's what supplementary means, adding up to 180. There are many, many congruent angles in this diagram, but all the ones that are congruent would also be considered vertical with respect to each other, because vertical angles are congruent. 3 is congruent to 1. 10 is congruent to 12, and so forth. So moving on, here's another diagram that you might see, and it's going to ask again, is there any vertical angles in here? There's actually no vertical angles. There's no angle that comes across that's coming out this side like this. If this line extended, then that would be a vertical angle to that. But there is no line there, so we would consider there to be no vertical angles in this diagram. There are many adjacent angles in this diagram. For instance, if I was to somehow get my pen here, this angle here would be adjacent to this angle here. And be careful on how you write them, because this now you would say, all right, we would say angle B, that's a word B, E, A is adjacent to angle DEA, DEA. So I have to use the 3 letters. Make sure you always use the vertex, the pointy end of the angle, as your middle letter. The other 2 do not matter when you specify specific angles. There are no congruent angles in here. There are supplementary angle, and I'm going to show this in a different pen color. If I was to talk about this angle here, BED is supplementary to CEB. Those would be supplementary because those 2 add up to 180. Again, a lot more complex, but we have lots of vertical angles. We have lots of, so those red ones are vertical angles. We have lots of supplementary angles. For instance, this angle here and this angle here, or maybe this angle here. So these 2, or maybe these 2 would be considered supplementary. We have no complementary. We have many adjacent. Well, for instance, those same 3 green, B is adjacent to, and I don't want to say angle B, angle JBI is adjacent to JBH. I think I said G, but 8, right? Congruent angles would be all your vertical angles would be congruent. Now, we're going to use that to find missing angles. So for instance, on this one, we have 2 angles that form a line, so they're supplementary. So what I would do is I'd take 180, and I would minus off the 29, and I would get a value of 1.751. So this angle here, angle M, would be 151 degrees because the 2 angles together add up to 180. Likewise, in the next diagram here, what is the value of C? These 2 angles are vertical angles. If they're vertical angles, they're congruent. You would say they're 26.6 degrees because they are congruent. The next diagram says the measure of angle 159.4. What is the measure of its supplement, of the supplementary angle? Well, I would just minus this from 180 to find its supplement. So I'd go like this. I would get a 6 point, and I had to borrow from there. That's 9. 9 minus that, 0. 8 minus 5 is 3. 1 minus 1 is 0. So it'd be 30.6 would be the supplementary angle. If I want the complementary angle, complementary add up to 90 degrees. So I just minus from 90 degrees. I'd get a 3 point. Now I had to borrow from this, so that's going to be a 9 minus a 1, which is 8. And then I had to borrow from this, which is going to be an 8 minus 6, which is a 28.3 degrees, would be the complementary angles, because complementary angles add up to 90. Now, you might get some that are a little harder where it says an angle measures 172 degrees less than the measure of its supplementary angle. So you actually have to write an equation. What I would do is I go, all right, here's my angle measure, okay? An angle measure measures 172 less than the measure of its supplement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this angle measure that I don't know, and I'm going to add it to its supplement. Now its supplement is its same measure plus an additional 172 degrees, because remember, angle A, or that unknown angle, is 172 less than, so this would be its supplement, would be 172 more than, and that equals 180 degrees, because the two added together add up to 180. Now I got 2a, because what I did was I added the two a's together, equals, I'm going to minus the 172, and I'm going to find out that the initial angle is obviously, well, I got to divide by 2 first. 2a equals a, or a, when I divide by 2, a is 4 degrees. So one of the angles is 4 degrees. The other angle would be 176, which is 4 degrees less. Does that make sense? 4 plus 176 is 180, and an angle measure is 172 degrees less than the measure of its supplement. So those would be the two angle measures. Hopefully this will allow you to do all your IXL lessons. If you have questions, please log on during the appropriate time, and I will help you. Come on. I want to get back to here.